Okay, so this is my presentation on the National Prohibition Act, more commonly known as the Volstead Act. So, the Prohibition Act has its origins in the temperance movement in the early 1800s. Basically, what this was there was a growing sentiment and this growing anti-alcohol sentiment where people wanted to seek more virtue in their lives. They thought that alcohol was the main cause of a lot of bad stuff like crime, disorder, and poverty and stuff like that. And you can see this in stuff like religious revivalism, the point of which was all individuals are capable of good and salvation, and there was this crusade against personal immorality and things like that. So states begin passing their own prohibition laws in this time period in the early 1800s, but there is no form of national prohibition yet. So we're going to be seeing the beginning of some groups like the American Temperance Society in this time period, which are anti-alcohol or anti-saloon in some form or fashion. And this and the movement kind of goes in a dead spot, you might say that. It's not as active throughout the mid 1800s, but in the 1870s it kind of starts to get big again, which you can see here with a bunch of people pouring alcohol in the streets. And in this resurgence, you're going to see more groups pop up, like the Anti-Saloon League, which was more against saloons specifically, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which we're going to see how women played a major role in the temperance movement in the next slide. And here's a poster for the Anti-Saloon League. So, one of the main supportive groups of the temperance movement was women. And the main reason for this was because women had a negative view on alcohol due to how it affected their family life or their family in general. Their husbands would often come home late from work, super drunk. They might abuse their wives. They might spend too much money on alcohol or lose their jobs because they're not working well because they're always drunk. And obviously, women didn't like this. So, this was a major factor in women being anti alcohol in this time period and being one of the biggest supportive groups of the temperance movement. Another major group supporting it was factory owners, and this was mainly because they wanted workers to be able to meet the new demands of industrial labor. So that's long hours, getting up early in the morning and staying up late at night. And if they're drunk or intoxicated in some capacity, that's quite difficult. So they're going to be anti-alcohol because they want their workers to work better. So the establishment of prohibition. Prohibition starts in World War I with President Woodrow Wilson. And the basic goal of the beginning of Prohibition was to save grain for food production so that they could use it for resources and food for their soldiers out at war, which happened in 1917. You can see this poster here with a soldier pointing at the viewer saying, "Will you back me or back booze? Vote yes for Prohibition." So this gets approved and temporary prohibition is enacted in order to save grain for food production in World War I. That same year, the 18th Amendment is submitted, and this is basically the prohibition that has to do with the Prohibition Act. It's banning the sale, manufacture, and transportation, all that, of alcoholic beverages in general. And this is ratified in January of 1919. It was given 7 years for ratification, but only took 11 months. So you can see that there was definitely a large amount of desire for this prohibition if it got approved so fast. You can see a newspaper article there talking about U.S. has voted dry, 36th state ratifies dry amendment. Dry and wet was kind of what was used to describe areas that had prohibition or didn't have prohibition. Dry meaning no prohibition, and wet meaning there isn't any. So after this comes the National Prohibition Act, better known as the Volstead Act because it was championed by Representative Andrew Volstead of Mississippi. Basically, what the Prohibition Act does is it allows for the enforcement of the 18th Amendment. It details how it's going to be enforced and how they're going to keep people from selling, manufacturing alcohol, all that. And it is passed in October of 1919. Here you can see the first page of the document. So in terms of enforcement and opposition, enforcement was mainly done by prohibition officers. And these guys kind of patrolled around, made sure that people weren't, drinking alcohol, and they did things like confiscate alcohol and like shut down places that were selling it and all that. So they were the main enforcers of the law that people kind of watched out for if they were trying to avoid it. And prohibition was more strongly enforced in some areas than it was in others. It was more strongly enforced in rural areas and small towns generally because those areas had more tended to have more sympathetic people to the legislation. Areas that had people that were more pro-prohibition tended to have the law more strongly enforced. In areas with less people who were for it, it wasn't as strongly enforced there, which was mainly urban areas. So you can kind of see that's a little weird how you have prohibition being more strongly enforced where it doesn't really need to be because more people are in support of it. And there were early signs of success. There were less arrests for drunkenness, and there was a reported 30% drop in alcohol consumption. But that's about as good as it gets, and overall, 30% isn't really that much when you're trying to completely get rid of alcohol consumption. Like, that means that most people who were drinking alcoholic beverages before still were because it was only a 30% drop. And because of a lot of this, the government was struggling to enforce prohibition a lot. They had a lot of troubles. People would go to pretty great lengths to drink alcohol, and one way they did this was through bootlegging, which is basically the illegal sale of alcohol. And they would also hide alcohol. People would find very creative ways to hide alcohol. Some ways they would do this would be through hip flasks, hollowed canes, false books, that kind of stuff. And there was also informal production where people would just make it inside their homes for themselves. A kind of indirect way that laws can be enforced is through propaganda, which is advocating the law's cause, saying like this is a good law and you should follow it and all that. And one example of this is this propaganda film here called 10 Nights in a Barroom. And I'm just going to show you a quick clip of it real quick. So basically what you're going to see in this film is it's going to be reflecting the kind of values that brought about prohibition. It's emphasizing family values, being good for your family, all that, not hurting them, and contributing to society, not being drunk all the time, all that. So it's sort of guilt-tripping the viewer by using these values and emphasizing them into making them support prohibition, or at least trying to. So obviously, prohibition does eventually end, as you can tell by, people drinking alcohol today. So there were a lot of contributing factors to this, some of which we've already talked about. One was the cost of law enforcement. It was expensive to pay prohibition officers to patrol around, make sure people weren't drinking, and confiscate stuff, and it was expensive to run jails with so many more people getting put there because they were drinking. So cost of law enforcement was a major reason for the end of prohibition. Another one was the Great Depression. With the Great Depression going on, it was pretty attractive to create more jobs and revenue by legalizing the liquor industry. There was a lot of potential there to help fight the problems created by the Great Depression. So basically, the final nail in the coffin is FDR getting elected. FDR is running again, actually, but for getting reelected. He runs on this platform of calling for an appeal of prohibition, and this allows him to win pretty easily. People like the idea of getting rid of prohibition. So FDR wins, and one of the first things he does, pretty quick anyway, he helps pass the 21st Amendment. This is proposed by Congress in February of 1933, and it is ratified pretty quickly. As you can see in this newspaper article here, Utah swings nation to repeal as wet forces lose 2 states. Prohibition era ended by U.S. vote, as you can see on the left there. So Utah's vote ends prohibition, passes the 21st Amendment. Now, some states still did have prohibition to some degree, but they had all abandoned it by 1966. And at that point, prohibition was just completely gone in the United States. So one question is, was prohibition a good or bad idea? And personally, I think it was a pretty bad idea. There's a lot of reasons for this. The most simple one is people like their alcohol. They're not going to give that up very easily. And if you try and take away something like alcohol from people, they are not going to be happy with you. And as you can see here, there's this protest going on with all these guys holding up the same sign that says, "We want beer." Kind of gets the point across, doesn't it? So taking away something that people like as much as alcohol fosters a lot of disrespect for the law. People aren't going to want to listen to what you're saying anymore if you're going to do stuff like that. They're going to go to great lengths so that they can disobey the law now, and that might encourage them not to really respect the government in general, which isn't a very good move for the government on its part. Also, it hurt industry and jobs. A lot of people who worked in the industry lost their jobs, and there wasn't really any revenue to be made from alcohol anymore because it was illegal. So you lose a big section, a big contributing factor in the economy by getting rid of alcohol. And because of all this, I'd say it hurt much more than it helped. All this stuff seriously damaged American society, and a lot more than it fixed any potential problems that were there before that kind of led to Prohibition. So I'd say Prohibition was a pretty bad idea. Of course, there were possible compromises between the two sides as well. There could have been a law put in place that restricted establishments from selling a certain amount of alcohol to a certain individual within a specific interval of time. There could have been stricter laws regarding being intoxicated in certain times and places, but obviously there was no compromise made, despite how helpful that could have been. And that's about it. This is my works cited. Thank you for watching.